good afternoon, or good morning, depending on your location. Welcome to the Farm Service Agency's Coronavirus Food Assistance Program for Livestock and Non-Specialty Crop Producer webinar. My name is Latrice Hill, and I serve as the National Director of Outreach for USDA's Farm Service Agency. Presenting with me today, we have Kelly Brining and Brent Orr, both National Farm Program Managers here in the National Office. For today's webinar, all participants are in listen-only mode, but you are able to submit questions through the chat box. We will answer as many questions as we can, but depending upon time, we may have to follow up with you later with a response. As a reminder, there are frequently asked questions on a frequently asked questions page located on farmers.gov/CFAP that may have some of these answers that you're looking for. So we encourage you to take a look at that page before submitting any additional questions. Today's discussion will cover exactly what is CFAP, what is the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, understanding the notice of funding availability, and understanding specifically how livestock and non-specialty crop producers can participate in this program. So let's get started with the basics. What is the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program? In response to the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, or CFAP as we commonly refer to it, was developed to assist farmers, ranchers, and agricultural producers. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted ag operations across the world in many ways. Well, here in the United States, this CFAP program works to address two challenges that our producers have faced from the coronavirus. One, being price declines, and two, supply chain disruption. The pandemic has caused both a decline in demand for some commodities and affected the market supply chain. Some producers have had challenges in getting products to market before they spoiled, or had to dump milk from contracts getting canceled, or some were affected by school and restaurant closings. As we all know, there aren't any programs that will make us whole again, but this program does provide some financial relief through direct payments and will cover a portion of the impact made on farmers and ranchers. To ensure that funds serve as many producers as possible, producers whose applications are approved will receive 80% of their total maximum payment now, up to the program payment limit, and any additional will be determined by the Secretary and announced at a later date. To share more general program information before we go into details, FSA is accepting CFAP applications through August 28th. Applications are being processed as they are being received, and once approved, it will be processed for payment. But because FSA is working to ensure producers receive relief as soon as possible, FSA is not requiring standard documentation. There will not be required documentation for losses that are reported on the application. Producers will self-certify that this information is accurate. However, it's important that producers collect any documentation that they have and save it. In the event that documentation is needed upon USDA performing a spot check, or for certain commodities, the local county committee may request to see certain documentation. So it's important to hold on to the documentation, although it's not needed to apply. You will self-certify. Once the application has been submitted, any outstanding forms or issues regarding eligibility for applicants needs to be resolved within 60 days of producers signing the application. So the county office, once you submit that application, the county office will let you know if there's any additional information that's needed, and you will have 60 days from the time of submitting the signed application to submit that additional information. Producers who have an interest in an operation should apply individually. If producers are operating, let's say, within a cooperative structure, growers should apply individually to the program. While an application can be submitted to any FSA office, the producer's office of record will process the application. Of course, if you are new to FSA, you will not know or you will not have an office of record, so you will file an application in the county where your operation is located. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you'll do that. Eligibility. FSA has identified that certain commodities are eligible for CFAP payments by identifying commodities that experienced a 5% or greater national price decline as a result of COVID-19, or commodities that have had substantial marketing cost of inventories. Please note that this is not applicable for specialty crops in categories 2 and 3, and we'll talk a little bit about categories a little bit later. FSA sought to identify all available price data, including prices collected by USDA and commodities traded on the futures market. The 5% decline in futures prices for these identified commodities occurred between the weeks of January 13th through 17th and April 6th through the 9th. Covered commodities include milk, livestock, non-specialty crops, wool, and specialty crops. Some of the non-specialty crops that are eligible, and I'm just going to name a few, but a full listing is available on the website www.farmers.gov/CFAP. But just to give you an idea of what some of those non-specialty crops are, they include malting barley, canola, corn, upland cotton, millet, oats, sorghum, soybeans, sunflowers, durum wheat, hard red spring wheat. And payments will also be available for specialty crops. And some of those include, but are not limited to, almonds, beans, broccoli, sweet corn, lemons, iceberg lettuce, spinach, squash, strawberries, tomatoes, and then, of course, dairy, cattle, lamb, yearlings, wool, hogs, and pigs. These are just some of the eligible livestock and commodities that are available for CFAP. Again, a complete listing can be found on the website. You do not have to be an existing USDA customer to be eligible to participate in this program. It's also important to know that producers who may have been in the midst of filing for bankruptcy or closing operations but were still operating within the mid-January through mid-April time frame may still apply for this program. A question that is commonly asked is, well, what if I participated in the Small Business Administration's COVID programs? SBA, as you all may know, had two programs during COVID, the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. These are two programs that SBA announced a few months ago, and we want you to know that participation in either of these programs does not impact your producer eligibility for this program. You should also know that this program is not one that has to be paid back. This is not a loan. This is a program payment, so you do not have to pay it back. Processing entities are ineligible. However, for those entities that are eligible, there is a payment limitation of $250,000 per person. Now, what's different from other FSA programs is that some participants, such as corporations, LLCs, or corporate entities, they're subject to a special payment limitation. These categories can receive up to $750,000 based on the number of shareholders, not exceeding 3, who contribute at least 400 hours of active person management or active labor. Some of the commodities that are not eligible are listed here. Again, you can find that full listing online, but some that are not eligible for CFAP include sheep that are more than 2 years old, eggs, layers, soft red winter wheat, hard red winter wheat, white wheat, rice, flax, rye, peanuts, seed barley, EOS cotton, alfalfa, forage crops, hemp, and tobacco. An important note you see here on the screen is that USDA may reconsider the excluded commodities if credible evidence is provided. And we'll talk a little bit more about providing that credible evidence. Going on, continuing with general information regarding payments. Again, we know that these payments are not expected to make any producer whole or to compensate them fully for their losses, but the program is designed to provide producers with some financial relief. An important note is that if a producer has outstanding debts with USDA, they should still apply for this program if they're eligible. CFAP payments will not be withheld to satisfy any USDA debts. Now, as you can see, not all specialty crops or commodities were included in this CFAP program rule. A copy of that rule is available on the website. What is a rule? Whenever a program is introduced or implemented to the public, we have to publish it on the Federal Register, and it becomes a published rule. So a copy of that rule is available on the farmers.gov /CFAP website. And in that rule, you'll see the listing of eligible commodities for CFAP. But there are several specialty crop or a few commodities that were not included. And USDA needs your assistance in identifying those additional commodities that may have experienced loss or market disruption. So to do that, FSA has issued a Notice of Funding Availability, which is called a NOFA, to allow producers the opportunity to provide information on unlisted crops for consideration into this program. So this NOFA is somewhat of a request for information. FSA needs information to determine whether other commodities experience loss or market disruption to qualify to be a covered commodity under CFAP. So this call for data gives producers who grow commodities, again, not currently eligible under CFAP, the opportunity to submit pricing data, inventory, prices, market disruption information. And if approved, the new commodity will be added to the listing of eligible crops, and producers will have an opportunity to apply. The NOFA fact sheet, or Notice of Funding Availability fact sheet, is available on the website, and it provides specifically what you will need to do to submit that additional commodity, to submit the additional information, and where and how to submit it. You can submit it either online or by mail. It has to be submitted by June 22nd. So that is the urgency in making sure that we conduct A lot of outreach give producers an opportunity to submit those additional commodities and information that's needed to be considered for this program. Again, there's information online, and we'll talk a little bit more towards the end about how to submit that information, but there are certain questions and certain information that must be submitted with that. One thing I wanted to mention before we go to the next slide is that USDA is specifically looking for data or information on nursery, aquaculture, and cut flower products. So I've given you a brief overview of just the general basics of the program. Now I'd like to bring in Kelly Brining, who is our National Livestock and Forage Program Manager here in the National Office. Kelly, how are you today?
I am great, Latrice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you would now, provide us with a few specifics about livestock producers applying for the program.
Thank you. I would be happy to. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the livestock provisions under CFAP today. This will be a brief overview, and I certainly welcome your questions as we go through this presentation. But I just want to touch on some of the basics and go along with what Latrice has already presented to you as far as general program eligibility. These slides will be focused more on the commodity specific, and we're talking commodity of livestock and the eligible livestock for CFAP. As Latrice mentioned, the qualifications to participate in CFAP on the commodities, they had to experience a market loss or market price decline due to COVID, and the livestock that have been identified as receiving or being involved or affected by those market declines are cattle, hogs and pigs, and lambs and yearlings. And we discussed overall eligibility for eligible producers to apply for CFAP. Contract growers were included in our regulation as being eligible as well under the livestock provisions. Contract growers are basically growers that don't necessarily own the livestock, but they can be eligible for CFAP if that contract that they have allows the grower to have risk in the livestock.
Kelly?
Yes.
Hi, can I ask you a quick question? And I apologize. I tend to just pop in every now and then and ask a question or two, so pardon the interruption, but I want to make sure I understand. Are you able to give me an example of a contract livestock grower who has risk in the livestock versus not having risk in the livestock?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And I will say that the contract growers still need to meet an eligible producer definition, which means they need to have basically a share in the livestock when that livestock is or will be marketed. So an example for a contract grower that may be eligible for CFAP would be a grower who obviously does not own the livestock, but they are being provided livestock to care for. The grower does not own that livestock. However, he or she would be providing various inputs for the growth, basically, of that livestock, including labor, feed, and any other expenses. And they would also, to be eligible, they would also be required to receive a share of the proceeds when that livestock is marketed. So there are some agreements out there that growers do not own the livestock, but when the livestock is actually marketed, they do receive a portion of that marketed livestock. And that is the key, of course, for CFAP eligibility, because it's eligible to those who have been impacted by market loss declines due to COVID or market disruptions. So that would be an example, but I can't emphasize enough, the contract growers still need to meet that eligible livestock producer definition in order for, and you'll understand this as we go through the slides of how a payment is calculated. It's basically calculated on the share of that actual animal that either has been marketed or will be marketed. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. And is it safe to say that if a livestock producer already participates in FSA's livestock programs, are they also eligible to apply for this program?
I believe that's safe to say. I think most generally, I believe, like with my livestock forage program, they can be eligible. A lot of times it does boil down to risk. This program, however, is just a little bit differently because the payment is based on the share of the actual livestock to be marketed. So it's not just a full sweeping yes or no answer on that, but most generally I believe it is. But we really do focus on the marketability of that livestock itself.
Okay. And a producer can always contact their local office for more information on that if they have questions anyway, right?
Absolutely, yes, because every situation can be different, and it really does, we don't want to really dig into a lot of these grower contracts, but these growers know whether or not they are eligible for the market proceeds of those animals when sold and marketed.
Okay. Well, I didn't mean to cut you off. Just wanted to ask that quick question. And, I said contact your local office, but we actually have a customer care center, a call center, just for this program for producers to call. And we'll talk about that a little later. Kelly, you go ahead. I promise not to interrupt too much.
No, that's totally fine, Latrice. You ask any questions as we go. I appreciate it. So to finish out, another thing that is worth mentioning, we do receive quite a few questions on this, but there are some nice private protection products out there under livestock insurance that producers can participate to try to do some risk management for their operation. And this program is definitely designed not to discriminate against those producers who have taken the necessary steps to provide some risk management for their operations. So that does not affect their eligibility to participate under CFAP. This is a really brief chart that just basically talks about eligibility of livestock itself. So this will make a little more sense once we go through the payment calculation. But eligible livestock, basically for the first part of Part 1 payment, that is going to be based off of your livestock. There is a requirement that livestock must be owned as of January 15th on this one, on the Part 1 of the CARES Act payment, and sold between January 15th and April 15th. That livestock also has to be unpriced as of January 15th. They cannot have any type of written or binding agreement, and we'll go over that just a little bit later in another slide, but it has to be owned and unpriced on January 15th. If there's offspring that are born from that January 15th inventory and also sold during that same time frame, they are also eligible. For the second part of the CFAP payment process, we will be looking at a producer's livestock owned inventory between April 16th and May 14th of 2020, and the producer will select his or her highest inventory on a date in between those dates as specified. There's also some provisions for dairy cattle that have been removed from the dairy operation and production and have entered the beef cattle market, such as, cull cows that are no longer in milk production, or calves that are not intended for their dairy operation for the future, or any type of dairy production. Those will be entered into the beef cattle market, probably as feeder calves. Those are eligible for CFAP under the livestock provisions. In the contrary, livestock that is currently used for dairy production or intended for dairy production, they are ineligible for the livestock CFAP provisions. However, as discussed in other seminars, the milk that those dairy cattle produce is eligible for CFAP for the milk commodity, but the actual livestock that are involved in that dairy production are not eligible, as long as they are currently in dairy production or intended for dairy production. Since we do have that ownership date of January 15th for that first Part 1 CARES Act payment, any livestock that are purchased after January 15th and sold before April 15th would not be eligible for CFAP. And livestock, again, that are subject to an agreed upon contract, forward pricing contract as of January 15th, are not eligible for Part 1 CFAP payment. That would be, to explain that a little bit further, that would mean that the producer probably has established some type of pricing mechanism, price established on that livestock prior to when COVID affected the market price declines beginning the middle of January through the middle of April. Therefore, they did not experience a market decline due to COVID and therefore would not be eligible. So I've mentioned the 3 different types of categories of livestock that have been determined eligible due to market declines: the cattle, hogs and pigs, lambs and yearlings. We have further broken down those livestock categories into different types of categories. So we've broken it down to feeder cattle less than 600 pounds, and that would include all calves less than 600 pounds. Feeder cattle, 600 pounds or more. We have a slaughter cattle, fed cattle definition, which means cattle that are intended for slaughter that are obviously more than 600 pounds, but they are 1,200 pounds or more and are market ready, intended for slaughter purposes. Slaughter cattle, mature cattle, are typically cattle that have been removed from a breeding operation, such as cull cows, cull bulls, things of that nature, that are no longer used in a breeding operation and are intended to go into the slaughter market. And all other cattle basically encompasses everything else that doesn't fall into these other categories, and that's mostly your breeding cows, your replacement, or your open heifers, your herd bulls that you have in your beef operation. Hogs and pigs are basically broken down plus or minus of 120 pounds, and lambs and yearlings, that would entail all sheep less than 2 years of age. So the CFAP payment calculation, again, is designed to offset price declines and upcoming marketing costs due to COVID for the eligible livestock mentioned. The first payment rate, we call that Part 1 CARES Act payment rate or payment calculation, and it has its own rate, and that addresses the price decline. The second payment, Part 2 payment rate, is coming from the CCC funding, and that is a different rate and addresses the future market disruption that will affect their current inventories that they had on hand in the time frame that we'll discuss a little bit further here in a little bit. And those payment rates for yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt you there. Just had a quick question. So a producer who did not sell any livestock inventory during the date, can they still apply for CFAP? You know, the dates that you mentioned a while ago?
Absolutely. The Part 1 addresses the sales in the time frame of January 15th through April 15th. And the second payment entails the inventory numbers between April 16th and May 14th. They do not correspond with one or the other. A producer may apply on one or the other or both, whatever is applicable to their operation. If they had no sales in that time frame mentioned, they still have owned livestock inventory in the second time frame mentioned, they are still eligible for CFAP for that Part 2 payment.
Okay. And one more question, and I'll shut up. I just have a question. I'm looking at this slide right here that lists the eligible livestock. What about dairy cull cows? Where do they fall into all of this?
The dairy cull cows would be classified under the slaughter cattle, mature cattle, because as the definition says, they would be still considered breeding animals, because they are breeding cows basically for the dairy operation to enter the milk production. So that's what the mature cattle definition encompasses. That's where dairy cull cattle would be classified if sold and entered the beef cattle market under slaughter cattle, mature cattle.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem. So as Latrice mentioned, the farmers.gov website is a very good resource for all of these different provisions under CFAP for the different commodities and the payment rates for the livestock categories, as I have mentioned, and the definitions, and a crosswalk table basically of showing what some common livestock terms, how they would fit into the cattle definitions that I reviewed, as Latrice mentioned, are on that farmers.gov CFAP/livestock page. So we'll go through a brief application here in a little bit, but as I've mentioned, there's Part 1 and Part 2 of the payment calculation. Again, you do not have to have one bearing to the other. It could be independent of each other. However, when an approved application is processed, it should result in just one total payment if you've been eligible for both Part 1 and Part 2. So for a producer to come in and apply for CFAP, as Latrice mentioned, this is a self-certification process. The livestock producer would come in and need to report the following information on the CFAP Form 803114, and Part E is specific for livestock, items 19 through 22. So item 19 would be that eligible livestock category that is referenced in that table that I went over on the different categories. Item 20, the unit of measure for livestock is head. Item 21, for the Part 1 CARES Act payment calculation, the producer would need to certify to his number of head that were sold of his owned unpriced inventory as of January 15th between January 15th to April 15th of 2020. And again, for those bred females that were in inventory on January 15th, if there was offspring born from that January 15th inventory and were sold during that time frame of January 15th through April 15th, those offspring from that inventory would be eligible and could be included in that item 21 entry. Item 22 is the information that the producer needs to certify to, if applicable, for the Part 2 CCC payment calculation, and that would be their highest owned inventory on a date selected by them between April 16th to May 14th of 2020. And again, the producer would select that date on which he or she had their highest inventory within that time frame. Today you'll hear the term unpriced. As I mentioned, unpriced inventory as of January 15th. I just want to review that just a little bit more, just so we're clear on what unpriced is. But the purpose of CFAP, again, is to provide assistance to those producers who were affected by that price decline due to COVID-19. So if there was any, I mentioned this earlier, but if there was any type of agreement that the producer has entered into prior to that date that does secure a price for that livestock as of January 15th, the sales for those livestock that are under that binding agreement are ineligible for Part 1 CFAP. The 803114 application form does not capture a share in that application process. So producers need to understand that when they certify to their inventory and sales on that application, they need to ensure that this self-certification is only for their individual share of that eligible livestock. If you have multiple producers that you own livestock with, you must ensure that those self-certification includes only your share. So as we mentioned, this is a self-certification, but we highly encourage that you keep any kind of documentation that could, as requested, be documentation and could justify your application as you submit it. Applications are subject to spot check, and we have county committees established in county offices that is their role in administering farm programs in the county offices, and it is their due diligence sometimes to review applications, and they're the reviewing and approving authority most generally unless delegated. And so if they have any questions, applicants may be subject to being requested to provide this documentation. So we can't stress enough to keep your documentation in the event that it is either requested or if that application is pulled for a random spot check. So a producer's reported quantities may be adjusted once that documentation has been submitted, that if they determine that the quantity may be unreasonable or inaccurate based on the documentation received, those inventory numbers and sales numbers may be adjusted. So just remember, it's the producer's responsibility to account for your share percentage in those sales and inventory that you report on the 803114 application form. So you may ask, what kind of documentation do I need to provide or upon request or have on hand if in case I do get selected for spot check or county committee's request for supporting documentation? I would recommend that, obviously the Part 1 payment is based off of sales, so you should have some type of sales receipts for those sales. Part 2 payment is based on inventory, so you should hopefully have some type of verifiable inventory records, breeding records, feeding records, financial records that you provide to your banking institution, or there can just any information that can justify the numbers that you have certified to on that application, and that documentation needs to meet the county committees as acceptable for documentation, for justification, and supporting your certification on that application form. So we have a few examples of maybe some typical livestock operations out there that may be interested in the CFAP program. So I'll go over this in detail here of how maybe a cow-calf operation in this first example may approach the CFAP application process. So Rosario Farmer had the following livestock in inventory on January 15th. This is owned inventory and unpriced inventory. He has 500 bred cows, 15 herd bulls, and 50 replacement heifers. And he's certified that between January 15th and April 15th, he sold 7 calves born after January 15th from that inventory of those bred cows and 10 cull cows. So between April 15th and May 14th, he is also able to certify that his highest inventory on a date during that period was 480 cow-calf pairs, 18 herd bulls, and 75 replacement heifers. So in this example, it appears that maybe he purchased some additional herd bulls in the spring and also some additional replacement heifers. So to participate in CFAP, Rosario will complete the 80-31-14 in the following manner. He is certifying that he sold 7 calves and 10 cull cows between the time frame of January 15th and April 15th. Again, those were owned, unpriced inventory as of January 15th that were sold during that time frame. So the 7 calves would fall into the feeder cattle less than 600 pounds category, and the 10 cull cows that were sold probably at a local auction market to go into the slaughter sector, they would be classified as slaughter cattle, mature cattle. Rosario also is certifying that his highest owned inventory was the 480 calves, the 480 cows, the 18 herd bulls, 75 replacement heifers. So the 480 calves would be classified again as feeder cattle less than 600 pounds. And then the total of the 480 cows, 18 herd bulls, and 75 replacement heifers for a total of 573 head would be classified as all other cattle on the application. So here is an example of what that 80-31-14 form would look like. I apologize if the writing is small, but again, box 21 is for those sales entries. So the 7 calves that were sold and the 10 cull cows would be entered in item 21. The calves would be entered in item 22 under that same category, and then the cows, bulls, and heifers were totaled into the all other cattle category in as inventory box 22. Example 2 is possibly maybe an example of a cattle feeder operation. So 5R feeders had 7,500 feeder calves, over 600 pounds in inventory and unpriced as of January 15th, 2020. And between January 15th and April 15th, 5R certified that they sold 3,500 fat steers at slaughter weight over 1,200 pounds. 5R also certified that his highest inventory on that date between April 16th and May 14th, 2020 was 150 fat steers over 1,200 pounds and 5,000 feeder calves over 600 pounds. So 5R will certify on the 803114 form his sales of his unpriced owned inventory as of January 15th that were sold between the January 15th and April 15th, and that was the 3,500 fat steers that were sold at slaughter weight, which were over 1,200 pounds, and they would be categorized as slaughter cattle, fed cattle. 5R also certified that his highest owned inventory between April 16th and May 14th were those 150 fat steers at slaughter weight over 1,200 pounds. And again, they would be classified as slaughter cattle, fed cattle, and that his highest inventory of feeder calves of 5,000 over 600 pounds would be categorized as feeder cattle, 600 pounds or more. So here's an example of the Form 803114 for livestock for 5R, and he reported that he had sold 3,500 head of fed cattle, slaughter cattle in that time frame. He still had 150 cattle of fed cattle in inventory after that time frame, and 600 pounds or more calves, 5,000 calves of 600 pounds or more. So that would be his entry 22.
Hey, Kelly, on this particular one, wouldn't this be, and I could be wrong, but would this be an example of where payment limitations would likely apply?
Yes, ma'am, they definitely would be. If we would carry out that the slaughter cattle, fed cattle rate, I believe, is $124 or something like that a head. So obviously that's going to equate to more than $250,000. So yes, that would be the case, depending on how 5R, the operation itself, was structured.
Okay. Thank you.
So our final example would be maybe a smaller diversified livestock farm that sells, directly possibly to some other markets such as farmers markets or locally meat sales. So this example has Farmer Alex selling at farmers markets and maybe privately to community members. Farmer Alex has quite a diverse operation with cows, calves, bulls, some steers that appear to be ready to be butchered for processed for end use, and some breeding sows, boars, piglets, and some market hogs that more than likely appear to be ready to be processed for his end user markets. So between January 15th and April 15th, Alex is certifying that he had sold privately to some niche markets of 6 finished steers over 1,200 pounds and 7 market hogs over 120 pounds. he had taken those to the butcher to be processed and then sold the meat privately. And Alex also sold one live steer to a neighbor who wanted it for freezer beef. So in this instance, Alex would be considered that those animals that he took to the butcher to be processed and sold that meat privately would be considered sales for CFAP if they fell into that same time frame. So in the remaining, his highest inventory would be the remainder of those breeding cows, calves that were less than 600 pounds, the breeding bull, the breeding sows, boars, and the piglets. So the sales for Part 1 CARES Act payment between January 15th and April 15th would be categorized as 7 of slaughter cattle, fed cattle sold, and 7 hogs over 120 pounds sold. So livestock taken to slaughter and sold as processed meat are considered sales for CFAP. Alex will also report his highest owned inventory between April 16th and May 14th as the remaining of the cows, 30 cows and 1 bull, which would be classified as all other cattle on the application for a total of 31. He had 20 calves on site that were less than 600 pounds, so they would be classified accordingly under the feeder cattle category of less than 600 pounds. The breeding sows and boar would be considered hogs over 120 pounds, so that total would be 11 on the application. And then those 10 piglets that he had on hand would be classified as pigs less than 120 pounds. So the 80-3114 form, and in this case, he had several different types of livestock, so you would also have to fill out an 80-3114A continuation form. And I apologize, this is very small to see, but item 21 is again where we would include the sales, and so the 7 steers that he sold, fed cattle, would be entered in that category for 7 under sales, and then the butcher hogs that he sold and processed and sold as meat under that time frame would be 7. And then we would move over to the item 22 to report his highest inventory, and the item 31 would be the cows and bulls, and then the calves that he had on hand would be the 20 head feeder cattle less than 600 pounds. The piglets that he had on hand would be classified as pigs less than 120 pounds, and the sows and boar would be classified as hogs over 120 pounds of 11. Piglets, again, sorry I put that in wrong order, but the piglets are that last entry for the pigs less than 120 pounds. So I know those are somewhat simple in some area, but maybe some complex, and that's the examples that we have to go over today. I, again, appreciate any questions you submit, and we'll try to work through those just as soon as we can. Otherwise, that completes my presentation on CFAP Livestock, and I will go over to Mr. Brent Orr to review wool.
Thank
Kelly.
you so much, Kelly. Yes, go ahead, Brent. I was just going to say thank you, Kelly. And Brent, if you would share a little bit with us about one of the non-specialty crops, wool.
Thanks, Latrice, and thanks, Kelly. My name is Brent Orr. I'm the Program Manager for Risk and Production at the FSA National Office in Washington, and a part of this presentation is the non-specialty crops and wool. So we'll just dive right into it. Wool was included as an eligible commodity for CFAP, and you've heard the eligibility requirements stated several times already, so not going to get into that, but it's divided into two categories: graded wool paid on a clean basis and non-graded wool paid on a greasy basis. Just to make sure that we're talking about what wool we needed what wool we're actually talking about applying for, is that it's the 2019 crop wool, which is all wool that was shorn 1/1/19 through 12/31/19, but that will also include the wool that was shorn January 1, 2020 through April 15, 2020, as long as those sheep were owned by January the 15th. Now, the obvious question here is graded wool and non-graded wool. I'm not a big wool guy, but as I understand it, the grading facility for wool is not in this country. And so we're going to rely on a producer certification there. If something changes after you get your wool graded, then we will make adjustments. You need to come back in and make adjustments to your application. Wool producers are going to certify two amounts. We'll need the total 2019 production and in pounds of wool, as we discussed earlier on the previous slide. That includes all wool shorn from 1/1/19 through 4/15/20, and then the total 2019 production in pounds that was not sold as of April the 15th, but those sheep had to have been owned by January the 15th. So there's two different categories of two figures that we need to compute a payment for wool. So the CFAP payment for the calculation is this is just for information purposes only, but it's two different parts. One of them is a CARES Act part, and one of them is a CCC payment part. And what we'll do is we'll take those amounts and put them together, and that will be your wool payment. And here's another slide that just alludes to that we will calculate a payment. I mean, it's just a matter of just where we got the money from to make the payment. So that's your total payment for wool for CFAP purposes. Some general information: each producer will apply for their own payments. Whether you're the owner of the sheep and that's your wool, then you will be the ones that apply for it. The wool must be unpriced, and you've heard that discussed thoroughly already. To be eligible for CFAP, there are some future component prices that are contracts that we've been exposed to, and other commodities have not seen one of those for wool. But if there's no price risk, then that wool is ineligible for CFAP. What will you need when you the documentation that you'll need? You'll need the amount of you got to document what you applied for. You'll have to show the amount of wool that you produced from 1/1/19 through April the 15th of 2020, and then you'll have to document that you had that on hand on April the 15th, so that we'll know that you actually are eligible for what you applied for. So spot checking is always a component of every program that's conducted with FSA. And this is a producer certification, so we're relying upon you to provide us good information. Jumping from wool into the other non-specialty crops, and those eligible commodities are malting barley, canola, corn, upland cotton, millet, oats, soybeans, sorghum, sunflowers, durum wheat, and hard red spring wheat. Those are those eligible commodities now. You heard Latrice mention earlier that we have a NOFA process, whereas if you as a producer think that there was other commodities that were affected by the COVID-19 virus, then there's a process for you to provide data to support that position, and FSA or the USDA will evaluate those and determine if there are other eligible commodities that are available to go into this part of the program. Commodities that are used on the farm are eligible for CFAP, but they had to have been a product of one of the eligible commodities above. So corn for silage is eligible for CFAP if it was used on the farm. I skipped a bullet there that says unharvested crops are ineligible for CFAP until they're harvested. So we're not counting those crops that are still left standing in the field until they're harvested, if there are any at this late date. The only no-go as far as those crops, the eligible commodities are listed, are that grazing of those crops, if those crops are intended for grazing, they are not eligible for CFAP. And there's a whole list of and I've answered some of the questions that way. At the farmers.gov/CFAP, there's a plethora of information that's available there, and you can go to there and it will list a lot of the questions that we've answered and restate what we've already talked about here today. The purpose of CFAP is to offset a decline in prices because of COVID. The two different funds, and we've discussed that when we flew through the wool, but that's the purpose of the program. You don't need to necessarily know that, but the CARES Act and the CCC is what funds these programs, and there again, there's more information available at the CFAP link on the farmers.gov page. There'll be one application for all these commodities: Kelly's livestock, my non-specialty crop, and wool. If anybody had any specialty crop, or if there's some dairy, they should be on one application. You'll get one check. Excuse me. You'll get one check for that. And it's not, I mean, there are situations that may cause you to have to come back in and revise an application, or you may have forgotten one. That's certainly allowable. We're not turning anybody away from when they come in to apply for CFAP. We discussed this in the wool, but there's the payment calculations and what you'll need. And as with wool, we're looking at two different figures. The commodity part of it is a little different than the wool, so I'll go over that here. What we need is your 2019 commodities production, and then we'll also need what's on hand on January the 15th for commodities. We'll make a payment based on an eligible commodities 2019 unpriced inventory as of January the 15th of 2020, but that cannot exceed 50% of the 2019 total production. That's the reason we have to have both of those amounts so we can accurately compute a payment. Then half of that production will go through the CCC payment rate computation, and half of it will go through the CARES Act computation. We rely on your certification, just as with the wool that we discussed a little bit earlier, and you have to certify two different amounts, and we just covered that in the previous slide. We got to have your 2019 total production in bushels, and we got to have your 2019 production that was not sold as of January the 15th, 2020. So we'll have to know that for you to make your certification and to process a payment. Just some general information. You're going to apply as an individual. It says individual there, but I mean, very well could be the producer on the farm is a general partnership or corporation, but you should apply that way. The producer of the crop is the one that's eligible to apply. The important thing to remember there is things must be unpriced. As of January the 15th, we have to know that. There's a lot of different types of contracts that are available that lock in futures losses. And if those contracts were executed prior to January the 15th, then there was no price loss because of COVID, because that price was locked in. So there's a lot of things to consider there. We have some examples of eligible and ineligible types of contracts. I'm trying, Latrice, to slow down. I promise I am. There are two different types of contracts. Several different types of contracts there that you can go and look at. But if you'll go to farmers.gov/CFAP and look at the types of contracts, we have charts there that detail which types of contracts are eligible, ineligible, and eligible for CFAP, and it has to do with if that commodity is subject to price risk as listed in that contract. So it's just a lot of different information to process there. Some things, and a lot of things that you need to be aware of when you're making your application. What documentation do you need to keep? Documentation is the key. FSA always comes back and looks at things, especially when we do this program like self-certification. So we're going to need to know your total 2019 production, and then we'll have to know which was unpriced as of January the 15th. So what does that mean, Brent? Well, that means that you got to look at, we'll have to know your 2019 total production. I mean, that's pretty much easy to get. We'll have to know what you had on hand on January the 15th that was unpriced, which means we may have to get into looking at contracts to determine to make sure that that it really was unpriced at the time. But that's if you're full for spot check, those are some of the things that you'll have to provide for us. Excuse me again. Hay and solids is eligible, regardless of whether it was used on the farm or not. And all that has to be reported in bushels, which means it'll have to be converted from tonnage to bushels. Your FSA office has conversion charts, and they can assist you with doing that, but I want to remind you that in order for hay or silage to be eligible for CFAP, it has to be taken from one of those eligible commodities that we first mentioned back on the first page of corn, example, corn or sorghum. It has to be those types of commodities used for silage and or hay to be eligible for CFAP. It can't be just grass hay. Grass hay is not eligible for CFAP currently. I have a couple of examples here to go over. Shows you some variations or types of things that can be applied for in the program. In this example, Jordan Farmer has 2 farms, one in Iowa and one in my home county of Mississippi. Jordan has 100% interest in 4,000 bushels of corn grown in Iowa and 50% interest in that's grown in Mississippi. So on the application for 2019 total production, Jordan's going to report 6,500 bushels of corn. So that's one figure, so we just got to go determine the other one now. But as it turns out, of the 6,500 bushels that Jordan has in his bin, Jordan executed a forward price contract on 5,000 bushels on January the 10th. So guess what? That makes that 5,000 bushels ineligible for CFAP because that price was not subject to a price change on January the 15th. So now we're looking at 1,500 bushels. So the other item that we have to have then is that 1,500 bushels will be inserted or put in the application as 2019 production not sold as of January the 15th, 2020. Example 2, Danny Farmer cuts 100 acres of corn for silage. Danny reports that 1,625 tons of silage was harvested on those 100 acres. And it was a mild winter, and Danny certifies that there was 1,000 tons of silage remaining on the farm on January the 15th. So what has to happen here? Well, firstly, we have to convert those 2 numbers into bushels of corn. So we take that, we multiply both of them by our conversion factor of 7.94, and that gives us 12,903 bushels of 2019 total production, and then 7,940 bushels that's not sold as of January the 15th, 2020. So that would be the 2 numbers that would be inserted in the application for Johnny to receive to compute a payment. Some general information as I conclude. Producers should report all their eligible commodities on one CFAP application. We've discussed that several times already. Also, as we said, if something changes or you forgot something, you can always go back and amend that, or if a crop is picked up by the NOFA process, you can always go back and add that later. This is your part, Latrice, so I'm sorry I stepped on your toes.
That is quite okay. You were doing so well. They want to interrupt you. Thank you so much. I know you were rushing because, in the past, most of our webinars have been 1 hour long, but it looks like this one is going to go a little bit longer. But that's some really good information, and we appreciate both you and Kelly being on. One thing that I failed to mention at the beginning is that this is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be available later. So moving on forms and documentation, these are some of the most important forms that you will need to apply for CFAP. Of course, the AD 3114 is the actual application, CFAP application, and that is something that is automatically generated from the CFAP application generator and payment calculator. They talked a lot about different calculations. They talked about if you have a diversified operation and you have more than one commodity or one crop. Regardless of that, when you use this application generator, which is a payment calculator, you will enter all of your commodities under one file. Now, this is something that's important for you to know, so I'm going to go slow on this part. The payment calculator, which is also the application generator, it's going to automatically generate the application. It is an Excel spreadsheet. It is available and downloadable on the CFAP, the farmers.gov /CFAP website. And when you go in, you will enter all of your information, and it will calculate things for you. Regardless of you having 4 or 5 different commodities, you will use and open only one file. So if you're used to Excel, you know what I'm talking about. You're not going to have one file for my dairy, one file for tomatoes, one file for wool. No, you will have one file, not multiple files, and that's very important for you to remember. That will generate the actual application that you will submit to the office. These are some of the other forms that are needed, and I hate to cut you short because of time, so I'm going to just generally tell you a little bit about each of these forms. The CCC 901 is a form that identifies the members of the farm or the ranch that is a legal entity. So it captures the members' names, the addresses, the tax ID numbers. The CCC 941 reports your average adjusted gross income. You've heard us talk about AGI. That is adjusted gross income. So this is where you would report that adjusted gross income for programs where income restrictions apply. The CCC 942 is applicable. This certification reports income from farming or ranching, forestry, for anyone that would be exceeding that adjusted gross income limitation. The AD 1026 ensures compliance with our highly erodible and wetland conservation determinations. The AD 2047 provides basic customer contact information. And the most important form is that SF 3881. That's your direct deposit form so that we can process your payment, which will be made by direct deposit. Again, we've said it 100 times. I'm going to say it 101. Your best friend right now is www.farmers.gov/CFAP. There you have all of the tools and information that you need. Also available on that website are the frequently asked questions. A lot of the questions that you may have asked today that didn't get answered may be on that page. So it's updated quite frequently. Please visit that page. The payment generator, payment calculator, application generator that I mentioned is also on that site. If you're new to FSA and not familiar with our programs, on our FSA webpage, we have all of our policy handbooks and notices that's online and available for your view. You're able to get help on this. If you have any questions, we do have a call center that is open and available from 7:30 to 8 p.m. Eastern. These folks will be able to answer any and all of questions you may have. They can even connect you with your local office if you're ready to schedule an appointment. If you are a producer who has limited English proficiency or unable to speak English, we also have language interpretation lines. You would call the customer care line and press 1 to identify the language that's needed. A lot of our videos are closed captioned in different languages, so you would select which language you need. I'm going to talk on the next slide about the call center and the number, but I wanted to say that we do have Spanish speakers available, and we also have a lot of our information and fact sheets available on the website in Spanish. The customer call center that I mentioned is a center where we have employees from around the country manning lines, answering questions. This was established to provide assistance to you. As you know, during this time of COVID, a lot of our offices are not yet opened. We are still in the process of identifying when those offices will be reopened. But until that time, the limited staff that we have in the office are busy processing your applications. So it's important to utilize this call center for any questions you may have so that you can receive direct on-the-spot assistance. That number to call is 1-877-508-8364. Feel free to call them to get direct assistance. If you participated in our programs before, then you know we always require a farm number to participate in USDA programs. Well, for this program, no farm number is needed to apply nor to receive a payment. So that's very important for you to know. You don't have to have a farm number to apply for CFAP. There are some optional forms that are available to identify your race, ethnicity, and gender, as well as the type of farmer you are. Are you a beginning farmer? Are you a veteran and ag farmer? Those forms are the AD 2106 and an FSA 860. They're not required forms, but those are forms that are available that capture that data information. This slide provides the order of events. Again, you will access the application online. For anyone who's unable to access the internet or obtain and download things online, you can call the call center and they can have an application mailed to you or emailed to you electronically. You would schedule an appointment with the local office, and we do understand, we've heard that there have been delays in getting an appointment or appointments may be far out. Please keep in mind that this is a nationwide program during a pandemic with limited staff in the office to process applications, as well as the overwhelming response to the program. There may potentially be delays in you getting an appointment, but please do schedule an appointment if needed. Appointments are not mandatory. That's only if you have questions about what you're submitting. Once you submit electronically, and they do have a way for you to submit safely electronically, upload it directly to the county office that serves you. If they have any questions, they'll reach out to you and contact you. So please know that an appointment is not a requirement. It's only if you feel you have questions and need to speak with someone. Once you've gone through the calculator and generated that application, you complete it and sign it, you would submit it, and the office will review for approval or disapproval. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you will receive 80% of that eligible payment if it is approved. Repeating, what happens after I sign that application? If there are any questions or additional information that the office requires of you, they will contact you, and you'll have 60 days from the day you sign that application to resolve any issues or submit any additional information. Once it is approved, it is sent for processing, and it is processed to you via direct deposit. So you can expect to receive it through direct deposit. What is going to help you with this program? Visiting that website, reviewing all of that information, making sure that you use the resource line, the customer contact center, if you have any questions, and take advantage of the NOFA process. Again, this is your opportunity to submit additional commodities for consideration into the program. If there is a commodity that has not been included that actually experienced market loss at that rate of 5% or greater, please know that you have the opportunity through this process to submit it. You can submit it online. That website is on the website, but it takes you directly to the regulations.gov webpage where you can submit and upload that information online, but it has to be done by June 22nd. So the deadline to submit any information for additional crops that are not included has to be done by June 22nd. To stay abreast of any additional webinars, news alerts, events, we ask that you subscribe to receive that directly from our office. You can visit www.farmers.gov www.ssa.usda.gov/subscribe. Enroll your email address and select Outreach and Education. That allows you to be on our listservs, and you will receive Gov delivery notices of any pertinent announcements, information, events, and webinars. We thank you for your time. Again, this has been recorded. Once it has been transcribed and closed captioned, it will be posted to our webinar page, and you may download and view at any time. You can also download a copy of the slides that were presented today. Thanks so much for your participation, and I hope you have a wonderful day.